Okay, everybody, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar by the Miriam Institute. On behalf of my colleague, Rosita Panini, and on behalf of our great and powerful colleague, Alan Langer, I want to thank all of you for dialing in or for zooming in or for listening to us by any other medium. We greatly appreciate your time. And we've got a fascinating guest with us today. I'll speak a little bit more about why this particular individual is of real personal significance to me and to our organization and to the work that we've undertaken. But by way of a brief introduction, it's my great pleasure to be able to converse today with Major General Noam Tibon, a retired officer of the Israel Defense Forces. His bio is extensive. I'm going to read slightly abridged version of that bio. But Major General Tibon spent his military career specializing in counterterrorism and homeland security. His command positions include service as commander of the 202nd Battalion of the Paratroopers Brigade, deputy commander of the Paratroopers Brigade thereafter, commander of the Etzion Regional Brigade, commander of the Judea Regional Brigade, commander of the Nachal Brigade. It's a great one to be a commander of. Head of the Personnel Division of the Israel Defense Forces Ground Forces, chief of the Infantry and Paratroopers Corps, commander of the Judea and Samaria Division, and commander of the Command and Staff College of the Israel Defense Forces. And his most recent military position was that as the commander of the Northern Formation, which was the Lebanon front primarily, though not exclusively. And we're going to be speaking to General Tibon today because it's 14 years, ladies and gentlemen, since the Second Lebanon War broke out in 2006, a war that raged across the months of July and August. And General Tibon wrote a piece that's just been published in the opinion section of the Allgemeiner and is also available on our website under General Tibon's profile, entitled The Second Lebanon War, a Retrospective. And I'd encourage everybody to read that analysis penned by our guest today. So with that in mind, that context and that understanding of just how privileged we are to have him here, I want to turn to you now, General Tibon, and say welcome.
Okay. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I hope all of you are taking good care with this coronavirus. And especially hello to my family in Boston, Chuck.
It's wonderful to have Chuck with us, and I'm pleased that we were able to have him join us. And first of all, may I call you Noam for the purposes of this conversation?
Of course.
Great. So we're going to turn to the Second Lebanon War, which is going to form the bulk of that which we discussed today. Before I do so, tell us a little bit about the situation in Israel. We're reading a lot about unrest, civil unrest, and discontent over there because of the coronavirus. How is Israel coping with the coronavirus? It seems to be a little bit incoherent and frankly uncertain as it tries to move beyond this era. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the situation in Israel today is not good, mainly because of the economic situation happened because of the coronavirus and the political situation and the whole combination of the second wave of the coronavirus, which unfortunately Israel was not ready as well as the first wave. And we lost a lot of time and we opened the market a little bit too fast, and we faced a massive second wave. But I think the most important issue is the economic situation. When we have about 1 million people, unemployment, most of them young people, angry people, and this is not good. And you add to this a very fragile political situation of this unity government. So I can tell you that this is not the best time of Israel. I'm sure that we will be okay, but the most important issue is, of course, the young generation and the unemployment. This is something which is very troubling, and we have to handle the situation much better.
Well, thank you for letting us know, and I know that everybody wishes Israel a swift exit from its current difficulties and challenges. I want to turn to the paper that you wrote, because you began by saying about the Second Lebanon War that 14 years have passed and that now is an appropriate time to assess that conflict. And you begin really by expressing the following, which I thought was a very interesting phrase. You said, "Well, the Middle East has dramatically changed in the intervening years between 2006 and now, the risk of a future Israel-Hezbollah war remains." So I'd like you to parse that out, if you would. What has changed in the Middle East? Let's start with that question.
You know, the Middle East is always unstable, but I think that today and in the last few years, the main issue is Iran. And when you talk about Iran, you talk about Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran, led by Iran, and actually built by Iran in order to threat Israel along the northern border. And Iran is trying to be a regional power. We have all these nuclear programs that are trying to become a nuclear empire. And that's why the situation is still very, very complicated. On the other hand, we can see huge changes in the Middle East, especially when we're talking about Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, Jordan and Egypt, with basically they see Iran as the biggest threat in the region, just like Israel. So on the one hand, we still have a huge problem. On the other hand, there is a huge opportunity, and I hope that the state of Israel will use this huge opportunity to create better relationship with moderate Arab countries in the Middle East. In terms of the Lebanon war, and this is something which is very, very interesting, as I wrote in the article, the Lebanon war was an incident. It was a mistake. And basically, it was a very aggressive war, but since the Lebanon war, the northern border of Israel was completely quiet, mainly because that the main action happened in Syria and Iraq. And you know, the world is so dramatic, so today ISIS is not a big issue. But a few years ago, ISIS was the biggest problem of the world, and Syria is still struggling, war, and Iran is still trying to create this axis between Iran, Syria, Lebanon. The situation in Iraq is still very fragile. So Lebanon and Israel was not in the focus of the region in the past 14 years, but this situation, and again, the combination of a very bad economic situation in Iran, they are struggling with a huge coronavirus damage and a very tough economic situation, mainly because of the American aggressive policy against Iran in terms of the economy. And, you combine all those issues, still the situation is fragile and you have to be very careful.
So you referred to the aggressive economic sanctions imposed by the administration, and that's a very important context here. But on the issue of context, you also said that to go back to the beginning of this war, the Second Lebanon War in 2006, Nasrallah launched a kidnapping raid that brought about the kidnapping and the deaths of two reservists, Ehud Goldwasser and Eldad Regev. and they were on the northern border during their reserve duty. And you said that in doing so, Nasrallah hadn't hoped to cause a war, but he was merely trying to add pressure to Israel, which was in the midst of a separate military operation inside the Gaza Strip. Talk to us a bit about that context that was going on in Gaza and why Nasrallah thought now was the time to add pressure.
Basically, I believe Nasrallah, like many Israelis, and he himself told that if he had known that this kidnap would lead to such a war that basically Lebanon and Hezbollah suffered very much, he would never do it. But it was a very unique situation in Israel when Israel was inside Gaza and basically in this ongoing attrition war, and they create deterrence towards the state of Israel. The only thing that he was not aware, the sensitivity of the Israeli people and the IDF to human life, and especially to prisoner of war. We are very, very sensitive. Some would say too sensitive to the life of our soldiers. And the situation of the kidnap inside Israel, along the border of two reserve guys and killing 5 others was a little bit too much to the Ulmert as a prime minister. And Ulmert basically felt that, this is something which is threatening his whole, term in office. And basically, Israel attacked in a way that really surprised the Hezbollah. And you can see this war as a combination of situation, but not as a war that nobody aimed that it's going to be. But this war basically create a new era along the border. We can see that since then, this border is totally quiet. And we can see that Nasrallah is not getting out of his bunker. So in a way, even though that after the war, it creates a lot of criticism inside Israel, mainly about the operation of the ground forces and the casualties and the missiles. We will talk about it later on. But it also creates a huge deterrence and a quiet border for 14 years, and this is a lot in the term of the Middle East and Israel.
So you made this very, very interesting point at the outset of the conversation, and you've written it here, and you've said that as an Iranian proxy, Hezbollah was intended to serve as a deterrent against an Israeli strike on the Iranian nuclear program. And you go on to say it was not intended to initiate regional conflicts. So we're now seeing all sorts of explosions, detonations, and operations being carried out against not only the nuclear assets, but other assets of the Iranians. And whomever is behind that doesn't seem to be too deterred when it comes to carrying out those operations. Does that mean Hezbollah is no longer the deterrent that it was?
It's very interesting because basically after the second Lebanon war, Hezbollah lost its flexibility because the Iranian, basically Qasem Soleimani, which thank God he is, not with us anymore. And this is one of the brilliant assassination or military targets that, I remember in the history in the last few years, because sometimes one individual, if he is charismatic and if he is, brave, and if he is, understand the nature of this military situation, just like Qasem Soleimani, when you take him down, it really creates a huge difference in the region. But basically, after the Second Lebanon War, Qasem Soleimani became above Nasrallah. And basically, since then, Hezbollah is not doing anymore what they want, but they do exactly what the Iranians are asking them. And that's why they were so involved in the war in Syria and all kind of other fronts that the Iranians send them. Because in a way, the Iranian told them, listen, we invest so much money and so much energy in creating all these rockets and tunnels and, taught you how to fight, and then you waste it all on something which didn't help our nuclear program. And this is a mistake. And from now on, you are under us and under the Iranian command. And basically, this is what Qasem Soleimani did, which he created this front that Hezbollah was part of this front in the whole region of Lebanon and Syria.
So if they're not the deterrent that they once were, what's their strategic value to Iran today with regard to the state of Israel?
Basically, Iran is, still pushing forward their nuclear program. And basically, when they look at crazy countries like North Korea, which basically has nothing, but they have some kind of immunity because of the nuclear power, which is not so big, they want to join the club. And basically, they also learned the lesson of Libya, of Gaddafi. And that's why, in a way, Iran is trying to do two things. One, to become a nuclear power. Number two, to become a regional superpower. And basically, to be all over, from Iran, through Iraq, through Syria, through Lebanon, and to affect the whole region. And I'm not talking only about Israel. I'm talking about the Persian Gulf. I'm talking about this, incidents in the Persian Gulf against the American Navy, etc. So still we can see that, the Iranians, first of all, smart people, they have a lot of patience. And when you face their efforts, you need to be very focused, and you need also a lot of patience, because it's not, one strike and that's it. You have to be, work every day in order to prevent their forces in Syria, in Lebanon, and all over this region.
So when Nasrallah makes this calculation, he does this kidnapping, he underestimates how the state of Israel is going to react because of our sensitivity specifically to captured soldiers. One of the things that happens is the Air Force, the Israel Air Force, launches a massive, massive campaign into southern Lebanon, specifically the strongholds where Hezbollah was dug in. And Israel suffered very few casualties on the home front because it was a well-organized home front. Important to note, by the way, we didn't have Iron Dome back then. So there was a lot of investment in people moving to bunkers and rocket shelters and so on and so forth, very effectively done. But the airstrike was extremely effective. I mean, you can ask former Prime Minister Olmert, he speaks about it all the time. And you've said something that I'd love to get your further details on. I'd love you to elaborate on, which is that the success generated by the Israeli Air Force gave birth to a vigorous debate within the IDF General Staff and the Israeli government. One side of that debate viewed Hezbollah's kidnapping raid as a local incident, and they wanted to limit Israel's response to the air power and artillery firepower already expended. But That side of the debate didn't win. Where would you have been in that debate? Would you have been in favor of leaving this as a localized result? And why did that side of the debate not win? Because the end state would have been more advantageous to Israel at that stage.
First of all, we have to go back to the facts. From day one, we knew that those two soldiers, Regev and Goldwasser, were dead because of the signals in the SIM along the border. So it was not trying to bring back, live soldiers. At the beginning of the war, the airstrikes and basically what we call the targets that the IDF has, which was very, very good in terms of destroying most of the heavy missiles of Hezbollah, really shocked Hezbollah. And this is, the art of war. In the art of war, you always know how to start a war. The big problem is how to end a war and when to end a war or a military operation. And basically, Israel cannot take long wars because of the economy, because it's a very small country, and basically because of the rockets, which is covering all over Israel. So in the art of war, you have to always to assess the situation and then to decide what is the right point to call for the US or whatever in order to stop the operation. So I think that in the second Lebanon war, the first week was excellent. And the IDF, especially the Air Force, the population, everything went extremely well. And this was my opinion there. And I think I didn't change it, that it was a smart move to stop after the first week. Hezbollah was shocked. It was a huge deterrence. And, the whole world looked at the IDF, especially the Air Force, then the intelligence and the targets, and, it was excellent. But once you reach a very, very sensitive point, the IDF, basically the Air Force, finished the targets. And then you just throw bombs, which doing nothing. Hezbollah, in a way, understood that he is still alive and he started to launch rockets. And basically, in a day or two, you lost it. And then the situation escalate and escalate. We start to suffer casualties because the home front people were not so at home or at the safe rooms and shelters. And the IDF has a lot of forces along the border and some of the logistic forces which suffer a lot of casualties. And in Israel, at the end of the day, casualty is very, very important. And once we start to suffer too much casualties, the whole situation flips. And then the Hezbollah start to win and we start to lose. And basically this push the government to decide on a land operation in southern Lebanon. Now we have to remember that it was after a long, long struggle in the West Bank against the Palestinian terror. And basically the forces was very trained how to fight terror in Nablus, in Hebron, but they were not ready to this combination of armor forces, tank units, and to occupy the Lebanese territory. My generation, we grew up in Lebanon. As a young soldier, I fought in the first Lebanon war, and then I spent almost 15 years. I left Lebanon as a battalion commander. I lost few of my soldiers there. So I was very familiar of Hezbollah. But I was already a colonel. So most of the battalion, I was, a brigadier general, but most of the battalion commanders and the company commanders and even the brigade commanders, they never been in Lebanon. They were not aware of this very, very, very tough terrain of mountains and rocks. And basically the IDF suffer from casualties of those anti-tank missiles, this Coronet, very strong Russian missiles, which basically uh, damage a lot of our tanks and a lot of casualties. And the number two is the way that Hezbollah was organized to fight in the bush and in the villages. And basically the forces came into those bush and into the villages, and they were stuck in all kinds of small ambushes and a lot of booby trap. And we lost a lot of soldiers of those missiles and explosives. And basically this was not good. Today we know that Hezbollah was on the edge because he suffered a lot of casualties as well. But again, Israel was under a lot of pressure to finish the operation. So we were not aware how tough was the situation for the Hezbollah as well. So at the end of the day, on the one hand, it wasn't a big success in terms especially of the ground forces, but on the other hand, Hezbollah also suffered a lot of casualties, and it created a lot of deterrence in terms of the relationship between Lebanon and Israel.
So you've raised so many follow-up questions that I have because of that analysis you've given, and thank you for providing it. There's one overarching question that I've wondered about for a long time. The chief of the general staff at that time was Dan Chalutz, who came from the Air Force. And you've said that the Air Force was extremely effective within a week and had not only hit its targets, but had actually expended all of its targets. And then comes the campaign on the ground. Is it sensible? Does it matter whether or not the Israel Defense Forces has a chief of staff who comes from the Air Force? Is that an asset? Is it a liability? Or was there a particular challenge that was particular to Dan Chalutz that another former Air Force commander might not encounter?
This is a great question. In the history of the IDF, most of the chief of staff, and you have to remember that unlike America, where you have, the Navy and the Army, and the Marines and the Air Force, and basically each one of them is a military by its own, and it's all go under the president. Basically in Israel, there is only one chief of staff, which is the commander of the entire military forces. And most of the IDF is ground forces, active duty and reservists. And I can say that the IDF is investing in the last 20 years, mainly in the Air Force and the intelligence, because these are the strategic assets of Israel, the country of Israel, and basically those assets that bring us, a lot of success, even today. But when it become a war, it shifts. And to win a war, you need boots on the ground. And when it comes to boots on the ground, it becomes again the ground forces. And the ground forces were not so well trained in the situation because of the Intifada. And I think that Dan Chalutz, as a pilot, was not fully aware of the tough situation of the ground forces. And then, when he sends them to the mission of, occupy southern Lebanon, he was not fully aware of all this, the problems that we have in the ground forces. And that's why I think that at the end of the day, and I think it's not Dan Chalutz personally, but the way the IDF is built, the chief of staff is going to come from the ground forces, and traditionally they're coming from special forces, paratroopers. This is the place that chief of staff are growing in the IDF.
So one of the you've already mentioned a number of lessons. Where does the chief of staff come from? You think that that's an important consideration, although you're not decisive about where it needs to be, and you don't personalize it either. You also have mentioned the readiness of the IDF ground forces, and then as this conflict continues, you say that a key lesson from it is that when flooded with enemy rockets, the ability of Israel's home front to continue to function is extremely finite, very limited. So we know, unlike in 2006, we have the Iron Dome, and we have other areas of
we have the Iron Dome for the first level, and then we have the Arrow for the second level. So Israel really changed dramatically in terms of protect the home front command, but still, when we are talking about thousands of rockets, this is the arsenal that Hezbollah have today. So those level of protection cannot completely block. And that's why, the home front command really changed, and it demands a lot of understanding in the city, in the civil population, what to do and when to do, because we saw since then, especially in the operation in Gaza, that the civil casualties were mainly because people were not listening to the home front command, and they were, standing on the porch trying to take photos, etc. And I think in terms of Hezbollah, of course, they have a huge arsenal of missiles, long-range missiles, heavy missiles, and basically what they're trying to do in the last few years, and I'm sure that you are aware of all kinds of incidents in Syria, is the guided missiles. They try to change all their missiles to guided missiles, because today most of their missiles are not guided. So statistically, they cannot target a pinpoint target. And Israel is doing a lot of efforts, and I'm sure you hear from time to time all kinds of attacks in Syria. This is all regard to those guided missiles, because if they will have a guided missile, it will be much more dangerous to the state of Israel.
Even with those aerial defenses that you mentioned, so you have the passive defense, which is shelters and early warning alerts and alarms, such as the red alert alarm that many people have heard about here with regard to the Gaza Strip. And then you spoke about the other munitions that we have to defend Israel from the skies. But even with those, can Hezbollah overwhelm Israel's ability to defend itself? And how ready is the ability of Hezbollah to overwhelm that?
Basically, Hezbollah, also learns the lesson from the Second Lebanon War. And basically, Hezbollah spent a lot of effort in trying to surprise the state of Israel. And basically, they took 2 or 3 approaches. Number one is, of course, huge arsenal of missiles that cover all over Israel. And I talk about the guided missiles. Number 2 is the tunnels along the border. They learned from the Hamas that, when you can create tunnels that popping up inside Israel and can create surprise, this is a huge achievement to the Hezbollah. And that's why they spend so much time and effort to dig all those tunnels. And in the northern border, it's not sand, it's rocks. So it was a huge operation by Hezbollah. And thank God, with very good intelligence, we solved this problem. But if you will hear to Nasrallah, if you would listen to Nasrallah, you will hear that he's talking about occupied the Galilee. And basically, and this is the third level of the change in the Hezbollah, they create a lot of unit of special forces to raids inside Israel. For example, there is a small kibbutz like Kibbutz Chanita on the border. If they can occupy this kibbutz, kill the people, take some into inside Lebanon, this can create a huge moral problem inside Israel. And basically, this is what Hezbollah is trying to do. And if I will talk about the next war, they will try to create surprise to the state of Israel and the IDF. And one of those surprises is not only the missiles and the massive missiles attack, but also to send forces inside Israel and to attack military bases and civilian, like Metula. And we have, along the border, we have a lot of small villages and kibbutzim, and they will try to attack those. So the IDF must be ready to a very strong defensive operation at the beginning of the war, and then very fast to enter inside Lebanon to shut down the rockets and basically to destroy the Hezbollah military force. And I know that the IDF is working very hard on it. Hezbollah and the Lebanese government are fully aware that this effort of the IDF is going to destroy southern Lebanon completely, because the rockets are inside the villages. The forces are inside the villages, and if you want to shut them down, you have to get into the villages with a lot of power.
So I'm going to come back to that point. That's a very strong statement. I want to just finish from your article a couple of other questions, and I'll move on to some points that have come out during the conversation. You've already mentioned the fact, and you wrote in your article, that because the IDF was dealing in counterinsurgency and counter-terror operations in Judea and Samaria, that it wasn't necessarily ready. You explain that with examples in the article, particularly with regard to the Kornet rockets and missiles and so forth. Now, you then said that there was a public dispute, which I remember well, between the former IDF ombudsman Yitzhak Brik, who was also a major general, and the then chief of the general staff, Lieutenant General Gadi Eisenkot, who you know very, very well, over the readiness of the ground forces, with one saying that we were ready for the next round, the other saying presumably that we're not. How would you assess the readiness of the ground forces? And if I can sharpen this a little bit, Noam, how would you assess the readiness of the ground forces, knowing that on the other side, Hezbollah fighters are now veterans of long sustained guerrilla terror operations, not just with regard to the Israel Defense Forces, but of course with everything that's gone on with regard to ISIS as well?
General Yitzhak Brik was a company commander during the 73 war. I joined the IDF 1981. In my generation, Gadi Eisenkot as a chief of staff, Aviv Kochavi, my generation, we were not involved in the 73 war, which was a real heavy, strong war where Israel was caught by surprise, and we paid with a lot of casualties, both on the northern front against Syria and especially against Egypt. All the people that were fighting in that huge war which is basically changed the history of Israel. The 73 war basically changed the history of Israel, because after that war, the whole government changed. The right wing, Menachem Begin, went into power, and since then, basically, the right wing is controlling Israel. The IDF changed, and a lot of people, a lot of things, basically, it's some kind of dramatic event in the history of Israel. And basically, it's heartbreak, his personal memory from the 73 war that we were not ready. We were caught by surprise, and the forces didn't have the right ammunition, and the trucks and the tanks, nothing happened, nothing was ready, and a lot of problems, logistic problems. And basically, there was also a huge problem of the chief of staff and the regional commanders, and basically, David Elazar as the chief of staff, and the Southern Command. And if you remember, it basically Ariel Sharon as a reserve division commander, basically changed that war and entered, crossed the Suez Canal into Egypt, and basically this is what stopped the war. So I always listen very carefully to this generation, because I was not in that war. I fought in Lebanon, I fought in Gaza, I fought in the West Bank, so I've been a lot under fire, but never me and my generation, the leaders of the IDF today, never been in a huge, real war. And that's why when Yitzhak Breik is talking about readiness, I'm listening. Of course, the truth is something in the middle. But I think that Israel should pay much more attention to the ground forces, because on daily basis, basically, Israel is investing on intelligence. And today, intelligence is cyber, and it's huge. And, we are talking about bank of targets all over the Middle East, and you need good intelligence to do it. And the Air Force, which is always a strategic force of the IDF. But this is good for daily life. When it comes to war, as I said, boots on the ground, and you have to be sure that the tanks are ready, that the infantry is ready, that the logistic is ready, that the home front command is ready. And if they are not ready, you cannot win the war. And that's why, especially when we are talking about Lebanon, when we want a short, decisive war. We don't want a war that will take months. Israel cannot afford it. It's based not only on good intelligence and good air force. You need very strong ground forces, and I think that the situation is not good enough, and we have a lot of work to do.
To get ready for the next time.
Yeah.
So I remember coming out of that war. I served in the Second Lebanon War inside Lebanon, and the moment that we stepped back into Israel, more or less, we were told, not just by our commanders, but by the media and by politicians, we have to get ready for the next war, because it's going to be happening next year. This time next year, we'll be back inside southern Lebanon, and we'll be fighting Hezbollah again. And no such thing occurred. In fact, as you said in your paper, for 14 years, we've had very, very strong deterrence in a way that's not imitated or replicated on our border with the Gaza Strip, for example, not even close. So how has that been avoided? I know you said that Nasrallah didn't anticipate the reaction he would get, but it seems as though there's more to it than that. What accounts for this long-term deterrence now?
I think there is two reasons. The main reason and the most important reason is basically the war that happened in Syria. in the rise of ISIS. And basically, all the attention went to there. So this is the important issue. And, the war against ISIS, the US were involved, Russia were involved, and, local regional powers like Saudi Arabia and everything. So this is the important event. I think that the second event is also the understanding in Lebanon. And you have to remember that Hezbollah is a state within a state. It has a strong military force, which is basically stronger than the Lebanese army. But Hezbollah is also a political power. It's part of this very complicated government in Lebanon between Christians, Shia Muslims, and Sunni Muslims and Druze. And it's all very, very fragile in this, by the way, beautiful country. And that's why Hezbollah is always trying to maneuver between military force, terror organization, and political power. And it must be, all the time working on all those three issues. And Hezbollah is also very, very sensitive to the situation inside Lebanon, especially of the Shia population, which today is a majority in Lebanon. It changed. In the past, the Christian were the majority, but today the Shia population is a majority. And that's why he is less willing to take risks, because he knows that the Shia population, which basically is located in southern Lebanon, are going to suffer very much. And I think this is a huge deterrence. But on the other hand, I think nothing changed in terms of this fragile of the situation from totally quiet to a war, because nothing happened, and then suddenly, if they will try to, to create another kidnap or whatever, I'm sure it can, slippery slope very fast to become a real war in the northern front of Israel.
So before I come, we have a few minutes left. Before I come to the audience questions, I want to ask you one more question about your paper, Noam, and then I'll ask those questions that have been sent in advance of this call. Actually, you've answered a lot of the audience questions already in our conversation, but you wrote this very, very strong statement, and I want you to elaborate on it, and because you've alluded to it in our conversation just now. You said, the IDF's mission is to ensure readiness, maintain full alert on Israel's northern border, and prevent war if possible. But if it erupts, Israel is prepared to do what is needed in order to achieve a rapid and decisive victory, including raining down distraction throughout Lebanon. Now, that is a very strong statement. Two questions. What does that look like? And secondly, why the decision to apply IDF force to Lebanon writ large as opposed to just Hezbollah?
First of all, Hezbollah is, they have three main locations: southern Lebanon, Beirut, and the valley along the border with Syria on the northern part of Lebanon. I think that, what we see every war in Lebanon, that the Shia population, basically when the war starts, because the Israeli forces are entering Lebanon from the south to the north, they run away. And they run away to the valley, they run away to Beirut, and basically, all their villages, etc., is under Israeli, basically, forces. They also remember that Israel stayed in Lebanon almost 20 years. And if there will be no quiet, this security zone can happen again. And that's why I think that there is, there is a lot of history here of, all kind of, Israel basically spent many, many years in Lebanon. Of course, there were also attacks against American troops in Beirut, the Marine Corps, etc. At the end of the day, they know that we have excellent intelligence about their places, leaders, assets, etc. And Israel can shut down Lebanon completely. And I think that, again, this is the art of war, what to do and how to escalate in order to achieve your goals. Now, usually Israel is not so good of achieving the goals and then stop. And we talked about it before. But I'm sure that because of this history and because of what happened in the Second Lebanon War, the future war in Lebanon, Israel must be very, very decisive because the whole neighborhood is watching us. The whole Middle East is watching us. And if we were not able to crush Hezbollah, it will damage our, our hegemony in the Middle East. And that's why, this is a tough neighborhood. And when you live in tough neighborhood, you have to be very strong and very ready. And this is basically what I know that the IDF is doing. And it's not going to be easy, but Israel is much stronger than Hezbollah. And everybody must see it at the end of the future war, which I hope that will never happen.
So we've got a question here from Jordan, and Jordan asks on a separate topic. He says that you served at the same time as Benny Gantz. What is the skill set that Benny Gantz brings to his role as the alternative prime minister and as the minister of defense? You actually didn't just serve with him, you know each other very, very well, right?
Yeah. This is today, it's politics because Benny Gantz is not a general anymore. I think in terms of politics, this is my personal opinion, Benny Gantz did a huge mistake when he entering this unity government because basically once he did it, he stopped to be an alternative to Benjamin Netanyahu. And basically, we know from the history that everyone that trying to do such a government with Benjamin Netanyahu, basically, this is shut down his his political career. So we'll see what happened, but my gut feeling that that Benny Gantz is losing power as a politician. But as an individual, he had a tremendous military career. But even though that we have a lot of military generals in the IDF, which at the end of their military career, especially chief of staff, go to politics, I'm not sure that they are the best politician in the history of Israel.
Why is that? Tell us about that now.
Yeah, we have some very, very good examples like, Yitzhak Rabin and Ehud Barak. Both of them were prime minister. I think Rabin was one of our best prime minister ever. But when you look at the history of Israel, I think, that the biggest prime minister was, of course, David Ben-Gurion. Number two was Menachem Begin. So the generals, and I think Begin was a general. I think that Sharon was also very, very influenced in the Israeli politics.
Repeat that because your reception broke for a moment. Can you just repeat? You said Rabin was the best, and then you started talking about Begin. I just want to hear.
No. I think that in my opinion, the big three was, of course, number one is David Ben-Gurion, but then Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Rabin. This is the big three. The Israeli Mount Rushmore prime minister. I think that Ariel Sharon was also very, very influenced prime minister in a very tough time. But overall, I don't see that, that the Israeli generals are the best politicians. And that's why, I think that, when you look at the American history, people like Eisenhower, Grant were also military generals, but today politics is, this is my personal opinion, it's so ugly in a way that if you're a good general, it doesn't mean that you're going to be a good politician. And you need other skills than to be only a good general to become a good politician. And that's why I think Benny Gantz did a huge mistake, and we'll see.
So, by the way, there are another two questions that we have, and I do want you to keep giving your personal opinion. This is one of the things that we built the Miriam Institute for, which was a range of different views, all under one roof. And you've always pushed me and challenged me and challenged our organization to do that sort of thing. So, the question we have here comes from Trevor, and Trevor says there's a lot of anxiety about Israel's relationship with the United States because of the perceived erosion of bipartisan support. But is that anxiety justified, asks Trevor? Isn't it the case that because of Israel's strategic military importance to the United States, the relevance of Israel transcends bipartisan or partisan support? In other words, are we an indispensable ally, I think is what Trevor's getting at. And before you answer that, I just want the audience to know you come to us as someone who's very familiar with the United States. You're a graduate of the Kennedy School over at Harvard, and you also spent time in Quantico at the Marine Corps base there. Tell us about your perception of that issue.
I think when you look at the defense strategy of Israel, it's basically based on three important things, three legs. Number one, a very strong military force that, supposed to protect Israel and to win any war, because we don't have we cannot afford ourselves losing any war. This is number one. Number two is borders that you can protect them. And number three is the friendship of a superpower. In the history, it was, Great Britain and France, but for many, many years, my generation is the US. And the US support is not only important, it is strategy for Israel. Without that support, and by the way, without the support of American Jewry, which has a lot of influence inside America and inside American politics, Israel would be in a much, much difficult situation. And that's why my opinion is that Israel should always be in good faith with both parties. It's not our business who is controlling America, if it is the Republicans or the Democrats. It's definitely our business that Israel would stay the best ally of the United States in the Middle East. And unfortunately, I think that it is a huge mistake to take one side. It's a huge mistake in terms of the state of Israel because it is so important for us. And that's why I always believe, and I really spent 2 years in America. I was a student in the Marine Corps Command Staff College in Quantico. I was a student at Harvard at the Kennedy School at the time of September 11. I still remember how I saw that America changed dramatically. We should be very, very modest with our relationship to the big United States. Very grateful, and we should be very careful not to take one side, and to keep our good relationship with all Americans. This is very important for us.
The last audience question comes from Samara, and Samara asks, she says, as a young American, I've always been very interested in policy and politics and the idea of running for elected office. But you have said that in many cases, the political scene is becoming increasingly ugly and unappealing. What would you say to someone like me who wants to be in public service, but who is being turned off by the current climate?
First of all, I think that, if I think this is my opinion, that if it is in your blood, go for it. People love politics, and we need friends. We need friends within the United States. We need friends in both parties. We need friends all over, and good ambassadors. And that's why I believe that if we will find more and more Jewish American in the political arena, and in my eyes, it doesn't matter if it is, Republicans or Democrats, but good friends of Israel, this is something which we need very much. And, I of course, I travel all over America, and by large, you can see that most Americans love Israel, and Israel is very important for them. But on the other hand, there are also other voices, and the way that I met Benjamin, because I strongly believe that his organizations, Our Soldier Speaks.
I didn't understand that.
Sorry. Our organization, Our Soldiers Speak, is so important because today when you go to the campuses in the United States, in some of them, people are afraid to say that they are Jewish and that they are a friend of Israel. And that's why I helped Benjamin in the past, and I'm helping him today, because there are many, many fronts. And the most important for the state of Israel is really to find a way to talk to those young Americans that they will understand. And I'm talking about American Jewry as well, young American Jewry, that the state of Israel will be important for them. We need that the state of Israel will be important for them, and that they will fight for us. And good luck.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Well, Noam, I just want to thank you, and before I end, I want to let everybody know that Rosita and I first came to your office when we were Our Soldiers Speak, and you sat there in the Kiryah, in the headquarters, and you were really our first and really a trailblazer, a chalutz, if you like, for the work that we undertook. You were there as the commander of the Northern Formation, and you've really helped us. You helped us to build Our Soldiers Speak into what it was, and you've helped us to now parlay that into the Miriam Institute by way of your writings and your lectures to our audiences. I do want to tell everybody that if they have the opportunity, they should go to the Miriam Institute website and listen to your lecture to the military cadets that we brought to Israel about an incredible operation you conducted in southern Lebanon as a young officer in Sayeret Matkal, in the elite unit there of the States of Israel, and learn more about you. But most importantly, on behalf of Rosita and on behalf of me and our colleague Alan and everybody who's on this call and who will listen to it as well in the postcast, thank you so much for your service. Thank you for your dedication to the State of Israel. And I very much hope that you will stay in the public eye and help to steer the Israel conversation and Israel's destiny towards its brightest future. We'd be ever so grateful and proud and honored to see you do that. So thank you. Regards to your dear family. And thank you again for your time, Noam.
Thank you very much. Take good care of you and your families with this coronavirus. And I hope to see you soon again visiting Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.